to have 3 instances of acceleration beyond anything we can do to occur within a 4-hour time frame. And each of those is independent, right? We've got 2 radar guys, we've got 4 Navy pilots, and we've got a video of 3 different instances, and all are instances of extreme acceleration. I mean, I can't think of anything that's more convincing. And you know, Chris, I actually never believed that the government hid this information until this case.
Chris Lehto, welcome to LehtoFiles. Welcome to the show. I'm Chris Lehto, retired F-16 pilot, now investigating UAPs, the phenomenon, and I'm here with an expert in the field. So Robert Powell, he's a founding member of the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies. That's a 300-member organization. They've written several very interesting scientific papers. He was also the director of research at MUFON from 2007 to 2017 and created MUFON's Science Review Board in 2012. He's one of 2 authors, detailed radar witness on the Stephenville event. I'm very curious to hear about Stephenville. That's at Crawford Ranch. And there's some really interesting radar data on that, as well as the 2013 Aguadilla case. Remember that case? I've made videos on both those topics, as well as we were just chatting before we started here on the Nimitz case. So he's actually researching the Nimitz case at least a year before the actual story broke. And he was also part of the authorship that wrote the forensic analysis of Navy Carrier Strike Group 11's encounter. Robert has a BS in chemistry, and he has 28 years of experience in the semiconductor industry. So very happy to have you on the show, Robert. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Chris. It's nice to be on your show. It's good to, I've seen your show a lot, so it's good to get to kind of meet you in person in a way.
You've been involved in this topic for a long time. From my perspective anyway, the community is kind of going through a lull. We were expecting all these huge revelations to come out. We had the hearing, David Grush, and we had 40 whistleblowers. What is your take on the actual UAP community, the topic right now?
Yeah, I think Congress is continuing with the investigation. So I don't think anything's really slowing down in that area, other than, you know, this is an election year, so that's going to probably cause various pauses. And the report that Errol came out, really, it was a lot of nothing. There was really nothing to the report. Anyone who studied the subject learned nothing new from that report. The other thing about it that I thought was really surprising was how you had about 4 key media outlets that were given the report, you know, about 24 hours ahead of time.
Yes.
And normally a media outlet, like if they write about UAP, they'll have the flip side version of it, right? Have a debunker talk about, you know, well, this story, here's the other side of it, right? But if you notice on this, none of the 4 media outlets had the flip side, you know, oh, there's a problem in this report. And none of them have ever written about the problems in the report. There's one key phrase that they all centered on, and that was the report's statement that we find no evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence, right? But if you just stop and think about it, and this is the way science works, you can't make that statement either for or against having found that intelligence unless you define it. So what's the evidence that you have to find to make that statement, right? And Errol never did that. I mean, they're not scientists, they're intelligence operatives, right? And so we have to try to read their mind. Were they looking for alien bodies? Were they looking for a crashed spacecraft? I mean, my view is that's not what you look for if you're trying to determine if what we see in the skies is evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. So I think they, even on the big statement that they made that the media, you know, latched on, that statement doesn't have any supporting thesis behind it.
So in your experience, what is your best evidence that you've seen of this non-human intelligence? You mentioned they didn't describe what non-human intelligence is, but I guess how would you describe that evidence, and what is the best example of that you've come across?
Yeah, so I go into some of this best evidence in this latest book I wrote, UFOs.
Yeah.
And the key piece of evidence I look at is acceleration, right? So in the book, I make two big overview statements. One is UFOs are an actual physical object. And second, they are intelligently controlled. And all indications are whatever controls them is much more advanced than we are. And so to make that determination, I look at acceleration and I give multiple examples in the book. And I explain how we know what the acceleration was in a given event. So if you think about our current capabilities, right, and even project what are our capabilities 50 years from now, we don't have an object that can remain stationary in the air and then suddenly accelerate linearly at 10 G forces, let alone 100 G forces. Because usually when we're talking about G forces and our jets, we're talking about acceleration caused by curvature of the jet as it's moving, not by direct linear acceleration. I don't even believe any of it, and you'll know this for sure because you're an F-16 pilot, but I don't think any of our jets can do 2 Gs on linear acceleration. I believe
That sounds high. Yeah, that'd be a very fast acceleration.
Yeah, right.
2G.
But these objects go from sitting still, 10 Gs and beyond, and then sitting still again. So, I mean, you would have to take like an F-35 that was burning his afterburners, just sitting there for a moment, and then suddenly trying to accelerate, right? And he might get up to 1.5 Gs, and then to suddenly stop acceleration. And I don't know, he could probably do that for about 30 minutes before he ran out of fuel. But it doesn't really compare. So that's what I look at is what are the cases in history where we can be reasonably sure that an object has accelerated extreme speeds. And I've got many cases of this in the book where this happens. And so that's what I look at to say we have evidence of an advanced intelligence that has operated in our atmosphere.
Yeah, that brings to mind the Stephenville case. You know, we mentioned that just in the intro there, where you have radar evidence. You know, you have documented evidence of this object moving in ways, like you mentioned, they're accelerating in ways that our jets just can't do. You know, and another, I guess, case would be the Nimitz case, where we had radar evidence. But you remember back on Stephenville when you did the actual analysis on that? How much do you trust that radar data? You know, could it have been birds of some sort of, you know, unknown or other unknown radar returns?
Right. So in the Stephenville case, the reason I trust the radar data is I have visual corroboration of what the radar says is happening. And so this was really the most exciting case probably that I ever personally was involved in. So before I even had the radar data, I went and interviewed in person the individuals that were involved that had seen the object in Stephenville. And my favorite witness was the constable who was at his home, and he's outside and he sees this object he estimates 2 miles behind his home. And it's at night, all he sees is the light. So he sees this extremely bright light 2 miles south of his home. It's just barely moving around. He runs into his house to get his wife so that she can see what he's looking at. He says, "Hey, there's a UFO out here." She's like, "Hey, I'm watching my favorite show. It's my birthday. I'm not going outside." So his 9-year-old son comes outside with him. So he goes back outside, and he knows that when I'm interviewing him, he knows the exact time he was out there for 2 reasons. One, he knows when his wife's favorite TV show was on that he was watching. And 2, he heard F-16 jets go by before he ever saw the object. So we've got 2 time markers. So the F-16 jets go by. Later, he sees this bright light. Now he comes back out within, probably a minute of when he saw the lights south of his home. But now they're no longer there. They're up above his home. And this is in Dublin, Texas, near Stephenville. And he sees now 10 to 11 lights that are just randomly moving in just rapid fashion with no purpose. Kind of like what Fravor said that Tic Tac did. It's just randomly moving. And he grabs his binoculars. He's about to look at them closer up. And suddenly these 10 to 11 lights just become synchronous. And then they move at an extreme speed to the northeast of his home. And he's exaggerating when he says it was like they moved at the speed of light. But basically he's saying to his eyes, it was almost an instant movement. Okay, so you put that over here for a moment. Now I get the radar data from the FAA. And when I get the radar data, the first thing I do is I make sure that I know how to manipulate it correctly. And I do that by following the F-16s out of Dallas-Fort Worth to the northeast of Stephenville as they move southwest to a military operating area. So I track the F-16s on radar. Okay, then the next thing I do, I say, okay, we've got this down well. I look at the location of the constable's home. At the time, he said this is happening. Well, there's objects or an object on radar south of his home. And it's not totally stationary, it's just moving short distances every 10 seconds that the radar rotates. So you see it move here to here every 10 seconds, but it's not moving fast. It could be a helicopter, right? But then the next thing you see after about a minute of that, so there's about 6 radar hits, you see the next radar hit move to the northeast at an extreme speed. And so I calculated the speed. It's a minimum speed of 1,900 miles an hour. And the reason I say minimum is because the radar is only rotating every 10 seconds. So I don't know if it took the full 10 seconds to move or if it began moving much earlier. And the acceleration, and this is linear acceleration, just straight acceleration, was 9 G-forces, which is, we have nothing, I mean, short of firing a missile, we have nothing that can do that.
And I guess, and that's definitely supersonic, so was there any sonic booms mentioned?
No sonic booms, because that's close to Mach 3.
Wow.
No wind movement.
Originally I know that NPR actually reported on this case. They had a couple interesting articles at the time, and they said that originally the Air Force said it didn't have any fighters in the area. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Originally they said, but I think what happened, right, is the reporter, Angela Joyner, she called the PO at the base, the public affairs officer. And normally the way the Air Force replies is, we stopped, investigating UFOs in 1970. We don't have any comments. But as she mentioned, this guy was very gregarious, and he was like, oh yeah, I know about UFOs. Maybe it was a high altitude aircraft and the sun glistened off of it, and he was, just talking with her. And he said, but we didn't have any F-16s out there. Well, 2 weeks later, of course, the Air Force had to admit, yes, we did have F-16s. And I think the guy was, he was just talking, and he probably talked out of line. He should not have carried on a conversation with her. He should have just said, no comment, we don't do this. But he did. And then when she talked to him again 2 weeks later, and this guy was a major, and she said it was like he was reading a script. Because she says, well, now you guys say there were F-16s out there. And he goes, Miss Joyner, all I can say is, and then he reads his script. And she asks him, because he was so gregarious before, she goes, oh, come on. What was it? He goes, Miss Joyner, all I can say is, and he reads the script. So you can tell he really got, in trouble for having talked about that in the first place.
Excellent. Anything else from the Stephenville case that you remember that really stuck out?
Yeah, the other part that stuck out. Well, there's two other items that stuck out. One is another witness, Steve Allen, who was with three other witnesses, and they saw the object first, and they were at a different location, about 10 miles from where the constable was, and about an hour earlier. And he indicates these lights are moving, at extreme speed also. And on radar, I get two data points, and it was also 1900 miles an hour. But the problem is, if you only have two radar points, you don't know for certain, right? You do have a verbal testimony from a witness, but it's always possible, right? What makes it less likely is because this is going on that night, right? You have a constable an hour later that has a similar experience, so that makes it likely that what Steve Allen saw was real. So that was another event that was interesting. And then the third is I had 145 radar tracks on this one object. So there's no doubt that you're tracking an object, and it's moving. It's a second object. It's moving from the Stephenville area, and it's moving towards Crawford Ranch. Now, Crawford Ranch in the year 2008 was where George W. Bush, our president, that was called the Western White House, because when he wasn't in D.C., he was at Crawford Ranch. So there's this object moving at an average speed of 37 miles an hour, and it's headed straight towards Crawford Ranch. Now, there's a 3-mile zone around Crawford Ranch that it doesn't matter whether the president is there or not. You can't fly into that zone. So, but this target's heading towards that zone. Well, as I'm tracking it on radar, there's one point where the next 10-second movement, it went from 37 miles an hour to 540 miles an hour. And that is in one 10-second radar movement, right? And short of, I'm not even sure if a Harrier jet, F-35 didn't exist back then, but I'm not even sure that a Harrier jet could do that. But it moves that quick, and then it's back to 37 miles an hour. And because there's so many radar hits, there's no doubt in my mind that is what happened with that object. So meanwhile, it continues towards Crawford Ranch, and it's like 10 miles away when I run out of radar data. I asked for 4 hours worth, and that in 8 p.m. is when I have my last piece of radar data. But I'm confident it flew over Crawford Ranch, and I actually found two witnesses who live near Crawford Ranch, and I interviewed them a few weeks later, and they told the story of it, and it's at the exact time this happens. They're on their bikes, and they see this extremely bright light drop down towards Crawford Ranch, and then suddenly just move off at an extreme rate of speed. So I thought that was interesting. I never get into the comment, about, so why was it headed towards Crawford Ranch, right? Because, you get all this conspiracy and theories about that. I have no idea, but that's what it did.
Was the president there at the time?
No, he was not there at that time.
Okay, interesting. And you were also the MUFON director for several years, or director of research.
Right.
What is that job like? And can you bring out any salient points or the most interesting case, I guess, at the time through your MUFON experience?
Well, the Stephenville case was definitely the most interesting case of that time. And I had been in that role only about 1 year when that happened.
Okay.
So that was pretty exciting. For me in that role, it's a different type of organization, MUFON is, than like SCU. And the reason I founded SCU was we wanted a more science-based type organization. MUFON is much better at collecting reports and having people turn reports into them, but the analysis of those reports is not quite what I look for.
Yeah, I remember I was really impressed with the Aguadilla analysis on that case. I heard recently, it was last year, I think, that at some conference, Mick West gave some argument that it could be balloons somehow. I still cannot understand. Do you know anything about that recent counterpoint that came up?
Yeah, I understand his balloon argument, and it actually gets pretty technical to explain why that argument's not valid, but it's not that technical actually. So his theory basically, right, is that as you're in an aircraft and you're videoing something, it may look like it's moving faster because of the aircraft itself.
Parallax.
So,
Yeah.
so what we did in Aguadilla case is we eliminated the parallax issue because we said there are 3 times in the report where we know where this object's located. There's one time where we see it go behind a telephone pole, another time where it goes behind a tree, and then the third time it impacts the water, right? So if those are true, then his argument fails, right? Because we know exactly where it's at and we know the time, so we can calculate the true speed, and a balloon doesn't answer that. So what he has to do is he has to come up with another explanation, right?
Yep.
So the first thing he came up with was, okay, it must be a tie lantern because that's why it shows up on infrared, right? Because a balloon would not have shown up on infrared unless it was heated. So then, of course, the problem with the tie lanterns was the wind speed was an average of 13 miles an hour with gusts up to 25. Well, for anyone who's tried to light a Chinese lantern or Thai lantern and let it go up, it's extremely difficult. And once your wind speed gets above about 8 miles an hour, the sides of the balloon collapse from the wind, and it's just a little candle sitting there, just barely hanging on, that heats up the air in the balloon and causes it to rise. Well, when you got a lot of wind, you're not going to be able to fly those balloons like that. So there's one problem with it. Then the next problem he had to come up with is he had to answer, well, so somehow they didn't know where the object was, right? So that I can have my parallax argument. So they said, well, we see the object fade sometimes in the video. So that must be what happened, right? That those 2 times it just happened to fade as it moved behind the telephone pole, and it happened to fade as it moved behind the tree, right? And so I've actually taken the pixels that you see in the video, and the other times in the video where you always have things fade in and out just slightly, right? But at the times where it disappears, you've got like this many pixels, like a histogram distribution, and then suddenly it goes to 0. So they're just gone. And then the water becomes a real problem, right? Because it disappears for extended periods of time. So his argument there, and amazingly, Kirkpatrick, I think, must listen to West because he mimics the same argument without ever thinking about it. He says, well, what must have happened is that either the camera just kind of lost its ability to resolve at that point, or maybe the object's temperature just matched that of its background, so it disappeared, right?
The cold water.
Yeah. So the problem there, though, is you see the object, it's very dark, right? Here's what you see in the video. You see this very dark object, which is the heat the object's generating. And then you see the ocean. And when you see the ocean, you can see the waves as well as the non-waves. So you actually see the heat of the top of the crest of the water as compared to the bottom. So the infrared system is actually accurate enough to measure the difference between the crest and the troughs in the water. And that's because those systems measure down to 0.1 degrees centigrade. As part of researching this was fascinating. I learned you can actually track submarines with this type of system because the crest that the submarine will make as it moves through the water, there's actually a temperature change. And since these things can measure that much, you can see it. So there's no way this object disappears, right? and you see the different colors of the water, right? You see the dark and the light of the waves. So you can't have a camera that says, oh, I'm going to see the difference in the water, but meanwhile, the object is matching the color of the water and it just disappears. So the arguments, it's just like what they do is they just throw out whatever will stick next, you know. And so they,
Kirkpatrick said that. He said
yeah,
a similar thing about the gimbal. He said, "Yeah, I think it's just a lens artifact." Even though
right.
I thought very clearly two separate ways that it's actually moving up at altitude at 250 knots. It's
Yeah,
not some distant
I
aircraft.
would bet you money that Kirkpatrick got his arguments from Mick West. That and
Yeah,
this guy is a PhD in physics, and he can't figure out a better argument than that.
yeah, it's amazing. It was also Ryan Graves who was there. Said the object was less than 10 miles. It was out at 7 nautical miles away, which again just refutes all of the argument that in the gimbal anyway that it's a long range aircraft.
Yeah, because
Is
the
that the-
camera would have at that distance, he would have picked up, the wing or some
Yeah,
feature of that aircraft.
exactly. It seems like did you see that a lot? Was a lot of spheres, or did you see any boxes inside of a sphere? Have you heard of that kind of observation before Ryan Graves said it for the East Coast events?
I can't say that that type of object hasn't been seen before because there's literally like 200,000 different UFO reports, but
Wow.
it's not a common one. It's not one, that I've heard of before.
Yeah, and 200,000 reports. So what is your belief in the UFO phenomenon? What do you think the UFO is? I know you wrote this book about it, and you maybe explain it in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so what I think, there's no doubt in my mind that um, a certain percentage of these UFOs that people have reported, right? The vast bulk of them are things we know that people misinterpret, but a certain percentage of them are real objects that are intelligently controlled by some type of advanced intelligence. Now, what
Hmm.
I can't know is where they come from, right? I mean, it could be uh, from another extrasolar planet, it could be another dimension, it could be, some people say time travelers, it could even be something we can't even comprehend, right? That we haven't even thought about yet as to their origin. But independent of the origin, there's no doubt that these objects exist.
Hmm. And as Arrow says, there's no evidence of these objects. Do you think we'll have any breakthroughs? I guess this year, 2024.
Um, it's hard to say. I think Congress will continue to investigate, but I don't think that Arrow's going to do much in terms of investigation. I mean, if you look at, just think about this from the big picture. Kirkpatrick, the organization only existed 18 months. If he's lucky, he probably spent 15 months actually studying the subject. I've been studying this for 17 years, and I can tell you there is no one who's going to study the subject in 12 or 15 months and truly understand it. It's what they did is they just touched the surface, and he drew a conclusion without a basis behind it, right? Because he doesn't tell us what defines extraterrestrial evidence. What was he looking for to make that case? He's basically an intelligence operative. He's not a scientist. And to solve this problem, military actually has been working on this for 75 to 80 years, ever since 1942. And we've gotten nowhere. If we really want to come to a conclusion and try to understand UFOs, it really needs to be put in the hands of the scientific community and academia, which means Congress needs to apportion some funding in, probably several $100 million that would allow academia and scientific groups to apply for grants and do studies on the subject, because you need some very sophisticated equipment to be able to measure these types of accelerations.
And you mentioned Nimitz and how you investigated that. The accelerations on that, I remember, were really interesting. It goes from, I think it was 28,000 feet down to surface level in 0.78 seconds.
Right.
Dr. Kevin Knuth, he calculated that was up to, I think, 5,000 gravity forces, if I remember.
Yeah. And Chris, the thing that's interesting about the Nimitz case is there are 3 instances of high acceleration in that case, all within a 4-hour period of time. And there has been no UFO case in history that I'm aware of where you have 3 instances of extreme acceleration. So for your audience to kind of think about this, these are 3 instances of information that we have no craft that can do this. We have no craft that can accelerate, at 5,000 Gs or even close. It's mind-boggling to say the least. So you have that one piece of evidence, right? So that evidence is based on the memory of 2 individuals. Kevin Day, who was the chief over all of the radar operators, right? So that's what he recalls happening.
On the Aegis cruiser, right? The Princeton?
Right. On the USS Princeton, right? On that Aegis cruiser. And Kevin actually sent me his, I guess you might call it his review by the commanding officer of that ship, the captain. And his commendation was that he was his primary best senior chief, and that this guy, I mean, it was written as if, this guy is great, right? So you've got a guy who at that point in time had excellent reviews. And then the other guy, Gary Boris, at that point in time, they know each other today, but back then they didn't. And Gary was in the command center of the ship, and he has access to that same radar data that is that the radar guys have. So he sees what Kevin Day sees. And when I interviewed Gary Boris, he said the same thing as Kevin Day, but in different terms. I said, how fast did this object move? And he said, how fast did it take you to put that sentence together into your brain? And so he was saying it was just like that. So we have 2 independent guys who see radar data and see an object move at a speed that's beyond anything we can do. So that's one event of extreme acceleration. Okay, now move the clock forward about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and you've got 4 naval graduates in 2 F-18 jets, right? And they have been vectored by the USS Princeton to a location 50 to 60 miles away by radar. So the USS Princeton detects the object on radar. You have 2 jets move to that point. They look down and they see the objects. So now not only do you have radar, you have visual confirmation. Now, what's the odds that all this just happens to happen, right? It's basically close to 0. So these guys look down, they see this tic-tac. Fravor, who's the commander of the whole squadron, he and his backseater head down. He has no weapons, but he's flying down towards the tic-tac because he just wants to see what it is. At the moment he does that, the tic-tac starts moving up towards him. And then they start doing this circular kind of barrel roll going towards each other. Now, as Fravor decides, okay, I'm just going to zip across and try to intercept this thing. And at that point, he estimated he was about half a mile, which if you're in a jet, that is, close. As you know, is extremely close. Yeah. So he heads across. At that moment, object tilts slightly and it zips off. And as Fravor indicated, it was gone in 1 to 2 seconds. Okay, now think about this. So what did the other jet now is back up at 20,000 feet watching the event. Those guys say the same thing. Slate says, well, it's just like you shot it out of a gun. It was gone. So how do you answer that, right? If you're a skeptic, what do you come up with? Well, maybe it flew off into the clouds. No, none of those guys said there were clouds, and it was a perfectly clear day. Well, maybe the sun glistened and the object just happened to disappear from view. Well, the problem now is you've got two jets from two different locations, one at 20,000, one at like 8,000 feet. The glistening of the sun doesn't blind two different jets simultaneously, right? So there's no doubt that's what happened. So then it becomes a trig problem. You know the approximate size of the object. We gave it a range. Let's say, Fravor and the four pilots thought that's about 30 to 40 feet. But let's say they were wrong and it was only 10 feet in size, right? And so that it could disappear sooner. So we said, well, what if it's only 10 feet? You calculate with trig, we know our eyes can see something down to basically 1 arc second or 1 arc minute, which is basically 0.01 degrees of space. And to give the audience a reference, the moon is 0.5 degrees. So it's about half a degree. So we can see something with our eyes down to 50 times smaller than the moon. So you know how far it has to go to disappear from our eyes. So that gives you a distance, and you know the time, right? 1 to 2 seconds. And we said, well, what if it had been 5 seconds? No matter how you play with the numbers, you get G-forces that are well beyond anything that we can do. So that's the second instance. And then the third instance, right, is when you see the video and you see the object suddenly zip off of the video screen. And that was actually the slowest speed that we calculated. And that was around 40 to 50 G-forces. To have 3 instances of acceleration beyond anything we can do to occur within a 4-hour time frame. And each of those is independent, right? We've got 2 radar guys, we've got 4 Navy pilots, and we've got a video of 3 different instances, and all are instances of extreme acceleration. I mean, I can't think of anything that's more convincing than that case.
Yeah, and they haven't even mentioned it. That in the Arrow report, there was nothing about the Nimitz at all. Just nothing.
And the Arrow, all the Arrow report says is, well, we couldn't find any information. So, that's.
And if I remember correctly, Gary Voorhees also said that at least people in Air Force insignia came on and took the radar tapes. And I believe Kevin Day said that the radar tapes, he came back the next day and they were erased or removed, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. And Chris, I actually never believed that the government hid this information until this case. And so let me explain, when I interviewed these guys, why I knew they were telling the truth. So the first guy I interviewed was Kevin Day. I actually interviewed Kevin Day before anyone had. The media did not even know about Kevin Day when I interviewed him. He wrote a little article after a show I did, kind of like your show, and said, hey, I saw what the New York Times was, reporting about. So I sent him a little message and he replied back. So that's how I got a hold of Kevin Day. And I try to keep witnesses out of the media because the media can kind of change people's minds as they hear something over and over. But at any rate, the important thing was, okay, I interviewed Kevin Day before anyone's talked to him. At the end of the interview, he said, so I'm getting ready to write my report. And I go, to get the data of what happened in the last 24 hours. He was writing his report the next morning after this happened. And he said, all of the tapes were gone. He said, they've been deleted. There was nothing there. And I said, well, how often have you ever seen that happen? And this guy's had he was 15 years in the service at that period of time. He said, I've never seen that happen. I mean, this is a senior chief saying, I've never seen anyone that happen. So the question then becomes, what happened to the data?
Yeah.
So at that point in time, I'm like, okay, well, I don't know, let me interview, see who else I can interview. So then I get a hold of Gary Boris about 4 weeks later. And the first thing I determined was that he and Kevin Day were not friends at that point in time. And because I want to know that there's not any corroboration of that story, right? And he didn't actually know who Kevin Day was when I interviewed him. He actually went and got his logbook and went through kind of like, a high school annual, going through to find him, and he finds him, and he says, and you have to remember, this ship has 400 to 500 sailors on it. And he goes, oh yeah, I remember this guy. He was a senior chief, real sharp guy, right? But that told me they had not been talking back and forth. So what does Gary Boris tell me happened on that ship? So I go through his story, and we get to the end, and he tells me, he said, a helicopter lands on the ship, and two guys come to me, and they said, we need all the tapes. We want all your tapes and delete everything that's on the ship. And he said, well, let me see your identification. They won't give him identification. And he said, well, I'm not doing anything without the captain's orders. So they leave. They immediately coming back with them is not the captain, but his second command. And he tells Gary Boris, yes, go ahead, give them what they want and delete, the other tapes. Wow. So that's what he, proceeded to do. So what was neat about that is it linked in with what Kevin Day told me. Kevin Day didn't see helicopter land, but Kevin Day knew that the data had been deleted, and he knew that was an extremely rare event. So at that point, there was no doubt in my mind someone did delete the data. Now, just so your audience knows, if they don't already, there's this side note, where Commander Fravor said no data, was deleted. But Commander Fravor is a commander of a squadron, and he is on the USS Nimitz, which is an aircraft carrier, totally different ship, has 5,000 guys on it, and it's several miles from the Princeton in the battle groups. So I'm sure what he's saying is true for the Nimitz, but there's no way that he would know what happened on the USS Princeton. Yeah. USS Princeton, I mean, his jet can't even land on the Princeton. So he would have no knowledge of that.
And what about the E2? Because that should have also had radar data. Do you know what happened to that?
Yeah. Okay. So, and I'll tell you, I'm just super conservative when I analyze things, Chris. The E2, at the time we did our report, that was not known, right? And the information, the only thing that I knew about the E2 was I knew that the E2 had detected the object. Yep. So I had verified the E2 had detected the object. What I had not heard, which came out later, right, was that the E2's radar data had been taken. And so I'm not saying it hadn't, because it very well may have been. And if I had to bet money, I would say it was. But when I do an investigation, I do everything. And then once that information gets out, then I always have to wonder, okay, did someone, is someone kind of there's two possibilities. One, they go ahead and yes, the radar data was taken. Or two, someone wants to kind of be part of the story, right? So they, say something that maybe is not exactly correct. But that's because I'm conservative, right? And that's not to say that the E2 radar data wasn't taken. It's just I was not able to determine that at the point in time that I did my report. And once I finished my report, then I stop it there, and that's where I have to end it, unless I can absolutely prove that the E2 radar data was taken. If we could get one more guy from that plane to come forward and say, yes, that radar data was taken, then I think that would be really valuable.
Yeah, and I heard recently Martin Willis actually said that Dr. Kirkpatrick said that they know as much as we do in the public.
Yeah,
Actually about the Nimitz.
Yeah, that's a sad state of affairs, isn't it? I mean, you have the resources of the U.S. government behind you, and that's all you can say. You can't go get any more information than that. I'll guarantee you, Kirkpatrick probably doesn't even know what's in the bulk of our report. I doubt the guy has even read it.
Yeah.
And I actually called the U.S. Navy has a base called Dow. Let's see if I remember the pronunciation right. It's in Maryland, Dahlgren. Okay, Dahlgren Navy Base. It's similar to like the Air Force's base up in Dayton, Ohio. It's where they do all of their research. So that's where the Aegis radar systems were developed, was at Dahlgren. And that's where all their research, their laser systems, their all their high-tech stuff is developed at Dahlgren. So I call and talk to the guy who's over their Aegis Research Center. And he was a young guy. He was 39. So I knew he didn't know about this because this had happened 20 years earlier. So he talks to some of the, I guess you'll call them the old fogies there in the lab. And they go, oh, yeah, we know all about that. And so I said, well, did you get the radar data? And he said, well, actually, we tried to get the radar data, but we couldn't get it. And I said, well, why couldn't you get it? And he said, oh, I don't know. Maybe they just didn't record it that day. I don't know what happened. And so that told me one of two things. Either that was a story he was making up, which I don't think it was actually. What happened, I think, was someone did get the data and they did try to analyze it, that Dahlgren did, but they couldn't because someone else had already grabbed the data. So that's, to me, that just supported further that someone had taken the radar data. And I want to get your take on this. So I'm trying to think, right? Who within 24 hours knows that this happened? Who could know that? Who could know to send a helicopter? Okay, so one, the U.S. Navy itself, right? A second would be NORAD, right? Because they're right off, they should be keeping track of everything around the U.S. Mainland as to what's going on. The third, which a friend of mine who used to work with the NSA told me, and this is where I'd like to get your opinion on it because I just found it kind of surprising. He said, well, our three-letter organizations monitor, U.S. military exercises. We intercept, those communications. So he was telling me basically that the NSA, that you have the Navy group, right, that's talking, about a military exercise. I'm not talking about the UAP at the moment. Just you got a military exercise going on. In the NSA and or CIA listens in on those communications. I was kind of shocked.
Yeah, that would be shocking to me as well. From what I understand, the NSA, that organization is supposed to just be looking at adversaries, enemy systems. So maybe over the ocean, I don't know why they're trying to look for enemy ships, listen for enemy boats, but that doesn't make any sense to me. That sounds really strange.
Yeah. But I know he did work with the NSA. Whether he knew that as a fact or that was a hypothesis on his part, I don't know. But I thought that would be a little strange. But the key point is that somebody, right, some U.S. group knew what happened and made a decision to remove that data. some historical research, and that happened one other time. And that other time that happened, where a helicopter lands on an Aegis cruiser and removes the radar. And so your audience knows the Aegis cruisers, that is the key radar system on a strike
Yeah,
group. It's not
it was
the
super top
carrier.
secret at the time too. It was brand new. Yeah.
Yeah, it was brand new. The other time that happened was back in the 1980s. The USS Vincennes or Vincent, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It was a USS cruiser that was stationed in the Middle East, and they accidentally shot down an Iranian commercial airliner. Most people
that.
probably don't recall that, but that, unfortunately, that happened back in the 80s. And within 24 hours, a helicopter lands on that cruiser, removes all the radar, not to hide it, but because it's going to have to be analyzed and to figure out exactly why we made that mistake.
Wow, that's interesting.
So, but the reason I mention that is that, one, it's important to realize that can happen, right? That you immediately remove radar data from a cruiser, but it's also very rare. It's very rare that would happen. So,
yeah, and there's two corroborating accounts that didn't know each other. It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And Dr. Kirkpatrick says they couldn't find it. They looked really hard. They called and asked, and they got no answer.
And I'll tell you how much they didn't work. I mean, to this part, I don't know whether Grush's story is true or not, right? That's for Congress to decide. But I can tell you one thing that Grush said that is true, and that's that Arrow, or at least I think is very, very likely true, which is that Arrow did not contact him and actively tried to investigate his statements, because the SCU tried to contact Kirkpatrick at least twice. And one of those, I was the one who tried to contact. They never replied. So they had no desire to know anything, for example, about the Nimitz case that the SCU had investigated or done. I mean, we had over 200 pages. Same thing in the Aguadilla case. Those guys never asked for our view of what happened or anything.
Yeah, it seems like they're not interested in actually finding out. Why did you write the book now? So I guess what?
Yeah, so this book, Chris, I've researched this subject for 17 years, and this book is basically all I've done during those 17. Not all I've done, but it crystallizes what I've decided that we know about this phenomenon, and why I go into why I believe it's intelligently controlled. And I go into some of the strangeness aspects of it, objects that are non-aerodynamic that fly, such as reports of barbell-shaped objects that fly through the sky, right? I mean, first, who would make that up? So, right, when someone says, yeah, I saw a barbell flying through the sky, and there are over 80 reports of those. And just the strangeness of the phenomenon where like a car will stop if it's too close to the object, or your phone and camera stop working. Even reports of where light begins to bend right near the objects. That it is just so strange. It's the most interesting subject I've ever researched.
It seems many people are afraid of the woo. They say don't look at the woo, which I think is the incorrect way to consider it, to just immediately discount information. But these kind of strange instances, it seems like that's where we'll learn the most, is from these extraordinary cases.
Yeah, that's actually where Dr. J. Allen Hynek, right, who was the original Project Blue Book scientist that worked for the Air Force. That's what drove his interest, was what he called the strangeness of the phenomenon, because it helped him eliminate any hoaxes or from people, right? Because it's like, why would anyone make up such a crazy story? Why would anyone say, yeah, I saw this barbell-shaped object floating in the sky, and then suddenly it took off and accelerated at a high rate of speed? I mean, why would you say that, right? And to have many people say that makes it even more interesting. And then the other thing I talk about in the book is what's on your graph here. Graph is, I think, the most likely explanation, although it's still a hypothesis, we haven't proved it, is that UFOs probably come from another extrasolar planet. And your graph shows that starting in 1992, we had like one exoplanet discovered. And you go to the current time, and today, 2024, we're approaching 6,000 exoplanets that we know exist. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Estimates are there are probably millions of exoplanets in our galaxy. So the question becomes, for most scientists, is not, is there intelligent life out there? I think most scientists will say, yes, there is. The only question left is, can they get here, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of us have this, well, we can't do it. Well, why could someone else get here? If we can't do it, there's the law of the speed of light. But that,
I made a video last week arguing that we've always been wrong in the past. It was 8 years before the Wright brothers flew. Lord Kelvin, he was in charge of the Royal Society, actually, of Science in England. He said it would be impossible for heavier than air machines to fly. And then 8 years later, the Wright brothers flew.
Yeah. But history's littered with statements like that of things, and then they get proven wrong. So,
well, excellent. But you are a scientist, and you've written this book. A Scientist Explains What We Know and Don't Know after your 17 years of experience in the field. So I'd recommend people to check it out. It's on Amazon and the SCU as well. Thank you for founding that organization, Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies. All the amazing documents and investigations you guys have done, and your help with MUFON as well.
Well, thanks, Chris. Oh, and one thing I want to mention is that we have our SCU conference May 31st to June 2nd. It's in Huntsville, Alabama. You can also attend live via the internet. So anyone who goes to our website, which is explorescu.org, can register for our conference. And you always meet some interesting people. I got to meet Jay Stratton, who was the head of the UAP task force, a real interesting guy, totally 180 degrees from where Kirkpatrick is in terms of not only being a likable person, but his view of the phenomenon. And then the other guy who we found out later was at our conference, and we didn't realize it was David Grush.
Wow.
He was there 2 years ago, and we had no idea who he was back then. But he was at our conference listening to, what all we had to say about the subject.
Yeah, and just the intro to your book, you said that that's why you really enjoy this subject and why you've stayed in it, is just all the interesting people that you've gotten to meet and learn from.
Yeah.
So, thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for explaining so much. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Chris. I enjoyed it.
Excellent.